to the COP29 United Nations Climate Conference in Azerbaijan. The goal this year is to raise $1 trillion in climate financing. One of the pressing needs is raising money for countries that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. Also on the agenda, raising money to help poorer countries curb their planet-warming emissions and cope with the growing impacts of climate change. For more on COP29, the United Nations Climate Conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, we've reached Eriel Deranger. She's the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action, and she is joining us this morning. So nice to see you today.
Thank you for having me.
And as I just mentioned, COP29, it is really focused on helping these vulnerable countries. But do you think it's doing enough, or do you think Canada is doing enough to help the vulnerable communities in its own country?
I think that's a really, really great question, because this COP is being coined as a finance COP, where they're trying to raise billions of dollars, trillions of dollars even, to address the climate crisis. And there is really a need for developed countries like Canada to absolutely pay up for the damages they have contributed to the global climate crisis to developing nations. But what still remains a real thing that needs to be addressed is the fact that our communities, Indigenous communities that are the first and foremost to be impacted by the climate crisis, exist in this country. My own community, which is the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, has been dealing with forest fires, droughts, water quantity and quality issues, accessibility to our river systems because of these things, impacts on our species. And there is no access to these new climate funds that are being created because they're only for developed nations to give to developing nations. And we really need to be addressing how we are creating fair and equitable shares and access to climate finance that isn't just for states to maintain their power, but rather how we're creating a human rights and an Indigenous rights-based approach to climate finance globally.
So just to add to what you've been saying, a recent report did say that Indigenous communities are actually 18 times more likely to be evacuated because of climate emergencies. So given that, what type of solution would you like to see developed for Indigenous communities when it comes to climate change specifically?
Absolutely. So this is a big topic here at this COP in the context of negotiating what the global commitment is to climate finance. Right now, it is, again, the mechanism is developed countries pay developing nations. But what we're saying is that Indigenous peoples globally are feeling these impacts with those stats, just like you stated. And we need to be talking about how Canada or developing nations address Indigenous peoples in their own countries, but even more so that we don't need to rely on the states all the time. That as Indigenous peoples of Canada, we want to be able to access the global climate funds that are being created and not have to go through the states to ask for permission or access to those funds. What we're asking for is new, additional, direct, adequate, equitable, and predictable funding through grant systems, not loans, that are accessible by all Indigenous peoples, regardless if they're in a developed or developing nation. And I think that this is super important because my own community in Fort Chipewyan was evacuated this past year for forest fires. We have had issues around droughts, floods, and numerous impacts from the climate crisis. And the chief, Alan Adam of my nation, has once said, if we don't find a way to address these problems, finally, and absolutely, that we may become climate refugees in our own homelands. And yet there is no mechanism for communities in Canada to access the Global Climate Fund as it exists and is being negotiated right now.
Eriel, we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to ask you, based on the conversations you've had with Canadian delegates, based on the conversations you've heard and were part of, how confident are you that there could be a deal coming out of COP29?
Well, there's already been some movement on things like Article 6 for international climate markets, which put Indigenous lands at threat. They're hoping to finalize that all by next week. They're hoping to have new commitments on global climate finance by the end of this week. And we're really a bit concerned about what those commitments are going to look like and how most of them are actually looking at keeping colonial systems with the power that they have in developing nations and allowing oil and gas and high-emitting industries to continue business as usual. We absolutely have to fight tooth and nail this coming up week to ensure that we have real, true human rights-based approach agreements for the outcomes of COP29.
Eriel Deranger, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.